Hello, welcome to the third session in the series of ancient art. Now we will discuss Egyptian art. Egyptian art marks a new beginning, but in history there hardly appears anything entirely new. One epoch in history, due to various factors, gives way to another. The succeeding epoch takes within it many things from the previous one and adds to it many more things of its own, which makes itself a distinct one from the past and future as well. However, due to the absence of historical evidence, we fail to reconstruct the transitional phase from the Neolithic past to the historical present of the Egyptian art and culture. The battle scenes depicted in the Spanish-Iberian Levant rock paintings of the Mesolithic provides certain clue to later developments which culminated in the Egyptian civilization. Battle as a theme and dynamic movement as its features, the Mesolithic paintings not only express a new approach to art, but also a fact that the life was ridden with conflict either within or between clans or tribes. Conflict begins to emerge. At the same moment, life begins to have an organized structure. Shortage of food in one group and its excess accumulation in another must have been sufficient reason for robbery, which made it inevitable to develop warfare on the one hand and on the other fortification for a stronger and larger social unit than loosely gathered group in the past. The fortification at the Neolithic site of Jericho near Jerusalem bears a testimony to this historical evolution. Robbery and conflicts continued incessantly, and it arose on a larger scale as a chief threat to the life in the river valleys of the Nile, Euphrates and Tigris. Endless conflicts in all these places mounted tremendous pressure to form a well-knit social organization unprecedented in history. Egyptian civilization represents the culmination of this process in its social, political, religious and military order with its imposing architectural fortifications. Origin of Egyptian art is traceable to Chalcolithic period, which in Egypt is around 4000 BC. An independent artwork hardly hails from this period, but utensils and ceramics. Their shapes and decorations provide us with the historical evidence of the fact that the Egyptian culture had expressed artistic urge from the very beginning. The earliest are flint objects of arrowheads, knives, club heads, axes and saws. There are also seen ceramics of this period in different form and shape made without the help of potter's wheel. They are decorated with incised drawings of hippopotamus, lion and snakes. They are brilliantly rendered with a few lines. Geometric abstraction painted in white or off-white on polished red clay is also an important group of motifs in this period, which can be presumed to be the continuation of the Neolithic expression. Later, boats, ostrich, flamingos and animals are added to the repertoire of motifs. However, no large-scale painting has come down to us from this period. The earliest example is a fragment of a wall painting in the Hierakonpolis temple of 3200 BC. It portrays fighting scenes between black and white bodied figures which seem to reflect local wars or raids. Perhaps it suggests a series of wars out of which there emerged two rival kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. The king of Upper Egypt, Narmer, also known as Menes, conquered the Lower Egypt and united the two realms of rule into one. One of the earliest full-blown artistic expressions of the Egyptian art took shape to commemorate Narmer's unification as found in the Narmer Palette. Hailing from Hierakonpolis, The 25-inch high Narmer palette was basically a votive offering made of slate. Its narrative content seems to celebrate the victory over the Lower Egypt. Its figuration in the very first glance appears conspicuously different from the primitive-like figures of Hierakonpolis wall painting. It should also be noted that the style of presentation of human figures in the Narmer palette continues in the succeeding period for thousands of years without discernible changes, which is something very surprising to know. With considerable precision, the meaning and content of representation in Egyptian art is readable, because unlike prehistoric art, Egyptian art with its visual articulation provides definite messages conveyed through disciplined orderliness of the design. Let us first read the scenes on both sides of the Narmer palette. Identified by name on the top box, Narmer in the palette seizes a war prisoner by the hair and is about to kill him with his mace. Two more defeated prisoners or enemies are placed in the bottom register. Facing the king in the upper right, there appears a bit of picture writing. A falcon standing above a cluster of papyrus plants is holding a hook attached to a human head. These images are in fact meant to repeat in symbolic form what is explicitly conveyed through Narmer's killing act. The head and papyrus plants stand for Lower Egypt, while the falcon is Horus, the local god of Upper Egypt, appears victorious over Lower Egypt. Therefore, falcon as Horus represents Narmer and his victory. Further, it is interesting to note that Narmer's palette may not be taken for the real fight, because the enemy is already conquered and the slaying as represented in the palette is about a ritual performed after conquest. It is evident from the fact that to sanctify his ritual act, Narmer has removed his sandals and the court official behind him carries them. We can see the same details reappear on the other side of the palette as well. It clearly indicates that the slayer is performing a ritual killing by standing on holy ground. The reverse of the palette shows the barefooted king marches in solemn procession to inspect the decapitated bodies of prisoners lying in the extreme end. Here too, we can see the heroic deed of the king reappears, but again in symbolic terms. The bottom register represents Narmer as a mighty bull trampling an enemy and knocking down a citadel. The symbolic meaning becomes clearer if we note the fact that a bull's tail hanging down from his belt is shown in both images of Narmer, and it was to remain a part of pharaonic ceremonial garb for the next 3000 years. However, we fail to decode specific meaning associated with the central figures of the long-necked animals and their attendants, which no longer reappears in Egyptian art henceforth. However, if we keep a close eye on the decorative animal motifs of the small votive palettes preceding the Narmers, we would be able to infer certain meaning of the long-necked animals. The tradition of a magical animal was in vogue in the late prehistory. The magical animal came to be identified with the symbol of totemic clan. Egypt remained faithful to the totemic worship of magical animal, as it adumbrates in its cult of Apis the bull, Hathor the cow, Horus the falcon, etc. Moreover, as René Hughes says, these animals, evocative of the earliest political divisions of the norms, are sometimes depicted fighting. Then they give permanence pictorially to the memory of rivalries and primitive combats. Thus, animal magic and visual narratives are combined in both works, which mark the starting point of Egyptian art. The long-necked animal motif in the Narmer palette expresses its much more refined and organized presentation, in which decorative aspect gains upper hand. Further, it is interesting to note that the prehistoric composition of various animals put indiscriminately together gradually gave way to organized and balanced composition with horizontal, vertical and symmetrical arrangement of motifs. The fresco at Hierakonpolis mentioned before is having depiction of a more or less symmetrical arrangement of two animals standing face to face at hind legs with a man between them. Their symmetry having striking resemblance with the long-necked animal motifs also helps us to trace to some extent the transformation of animal representation from prehistoric to the time of Narmer palette. Canon of human form in Egyptian art. After the unification, art became a powerful instrument of propaganda. Paintings and sculptures were in greater demand to glorify the ruler and his close associations with gods. Through the consistent construction of images, Egyptian art evolved into a culmination 3 centuries after the Narmer palette. Works of art by now became more legible and communicative as a result of the more orderly pictorial organization. From the tomb of Hesi-Ra, a high official of the king, Sosar of the 3rd dynasty, comes the masterly wooden relief showing the deceased with the emblems of his rank. We can see that 3 centuries time span did not change much the stylization of the human figures from the Narmer palette to that of Hesi-Ra relief. The view of the figure Hesi-Ra corresponds exactly to that of the Narmer palette. But unlike in the Narmer's figure, the proportions in the Hesi-Ra are much more balanced and detail of the body manifests the artist's keen observation of anatomical detail and technical proficiency. This style was gelled into distinctive characters of the Egyptian art in the Old Kingdom. To take another example, there is a painted limestone relief of around 2400 BC hailing from the tomb of Thi at Saqqara. Thi was an architectural overseer. He is shown watching a hippopotamus hunt. The whole hunting scene is set against a background of a papyrus thicket. Stems of the papyrus appears in abundance but in regular rippling pattern that extends in the top zone into agitated scenes of nesting birds threatened by predatory animals. Equally agitated a scene is visible in the water in the bottom in which struggling hippopotamuses and fish are huddled. All these along with the hunters are full of action, but Thi alone stands immovable and undisturbed as if he is not part of the scene. He towers above the other men by his sheer size. Size corresponds to the importance of personality. His passive pose is an important hallmark of the representations of the deceased in all such scenes from the Old Kingdom. In all these instances, and in many reliefs and paintings of a later period, the most striking feature is the obvious deviation from the realistic mode of representation. The artist transformed the human body in a particular fashion. He reordered it in order to make it convenient to transpose the 3-dimensional body onto 2-dimensional surface of the painting or relief. Let us see first what alterations he had made in his reordering. The human body is represented in dual perspective. The head is invariably shown in profile, while the eye and torso are in frontal view. Again, legs and feet are shown in profile as seen from inside. The 2 hands fully visible are shown always with 5 fingers each, which are not followed in the treatment of feet. In female figures, the breasts are seen in profile against the frontal view of the chest. When the artist was free to choose the direction of the figure, he always preferred the figure to be sitting or striding towards the right. If every figure in every scene looks exact in physiognomic details, That is so because the Egyptian artist strictly followed a set of rules or canon for the construction of images. According to that canon, a standing figure was divided into 18 equal units. A 19th one was reserved for the hair. The distance from hairline to neck was measured by 2 units, from neck to knees 10 units, and from knees to soles of the feet 6 units. A seated figure required only 15 units. This system of proportion was in use for thousands of years, but the units were increased to 21 and 1/4 by 7th century BC onwards. Diodorus Siculus in 1st century BC speaks of 2 Greek sculptors of the 6th century BC who collaborated on a statue, each executing one half. They followed the rule then current in Egypt of dividing the human figure into 21 and 1/4 parts. When each had completed his share of the work, the 2 halves fitted perfectly. Whether this description refers to a real event or not, it accounts for artistic practices based on mathematical precision and its infallibility. The proportions laid down by the canon, says Kazimierz Michalowski, were so exact that, in theory, there could be no error in reproducing a figure if the model on a papyrus sheet or a stone slab were followed. These models, the earliest of which may have been developed in the artistic workshops of Memphis when it was the capital, were circulated to all provincial centers of government and religion and were faithfully followed whenever temples or tombs were to be decorated with paintings or reliefs. The same canon and attitude was followed in the round and freestanding sculptures. The Egyptian sculptor thereby was able to execute a figure being devoid of a defect, how large its size might be. Whatever the precision and perfection of the figures might be, it would be curious to dwell upon the rationale which led the Egyptian artist to derive at such style and its perpetuation for thousands of years. We can see first of all that the three-dimensional aspect of the object or human figure is strictly reduced to the two-dimensional of the picture surface, and through which the flatness of the image is stressed. Light and shade or shadow is completely renounced. The artist must have been carried away by the idea that the attempts to deceive the spectator through rendering lifelikeness to the figure contained an element of vulgarity, and deviation from the real would lend his image more refined, a quality that art strove for. Incidentally, this formal reordering helps him to present the figures with maximum clarity and simplicity. For that matter, he gives of perspective, foreshortenings and overlapping of the figures or limbs one behind another. In other words, each part of the body, be it of human, animal or bird, was represented from a particular angle which gives maximum visual impression of it, and combined them together into a single whole. Different parts with different angles turned the figure to be incoherent and contradictory. The Egyptian artist thus could not free himself from the conceptual realism of the Paleolithic art, in which similar method was adopted. Of the canons of Egyptian art, the most striking and conspicuous is the frontality of the figures. Irrespective of the postures and gestures, the figure is more often shown with the emphasis on the frontal part of the torso. The whole chest is turned to the spectator, so that the upper part of the body can be vertically divided into 2 equal halves. This approach makes itself possible to offer the body in full view with the clearest and simplest form by avoiding confusion or concealment which in an accidental angle may occur. What we see here is an expression of a fundamental logic of representation that existed in the early phase of old artistic tradition, and it still exists in many folk tribal art forms. Accordingly, the body is to be depicted frontally while the head is in profile. This arbitrary arrangement goes more in conformity with logic than with visual appearance of the body. It is more faithful to the idea of an object, here it is body, than with the visual appearance seen from a particular angle. This systematic application of the idea of an object in a reproducible form is called conceptual realism, which is far different from our modern mimetic realism. As we have seen, the Paleolithic paintings of animals bring us the first expression of the conceptual realism. Lack of technical skill in rendering human body in different angle may not be the reason for employing the frontality, because in many instances figures are shown in various angles with convincing realism, especially in the figures of common folk engaged in various works. Moreover, even in certain periods in which canon was not strictly imposed, the representations remain embedded with the technique of frontality, but invariably with the kings. Considering these factors, Arnold Hauser observes, in the frontal representation of the human figures, the forward turning of the upper part of the body is the expression of a definite and direct relationship to the onlooker. Paleolithic art, in which no kind of notice is taken of the public, also knows nothing of frontality. Egyptian art, on the other hand, makes a direct approach to the respective subject. It is an art which both demands and shows public respect. Its approach to the beholder is an act of reverence. All courtly and courteous art, intent on bestowing fame and praise, contains an element of the principle of frontality, of confronting the onlooker. This becomes more meaningful when we take into account another fact, that Egyptian art strictly followed certain rules. Accordingly, gods and pharaohs are always segregated from others by easily identifiable poses and expressions. They are mostly represented striding or seated in the formal poses they assumed during their rare public appearances. High-ranking officials are also shown in striding and seated poses, but in a different way. Their body is not idealized, emphasizing the layers of fat on the body. They are treated more in realistic terms, and the lesser dignitaries were frequently shown with sagging flesh, prominent bellies and thick legs, but in a dignified hierarchic posture carrying a staff. The well-known wood sculpture of a village mayor, the Sheikh el Beled, vividly exemplifies all these features. The discussion on Egyptian art cannot be confined to single session. So, we will continue the discussion in the next. Still, we will have a few words on what we have discussed so far. Egyptian arts starting from 3200 BC marks a new beginning with the clearly readable images and figurative style. The style and narrativity continues for coming thousands of years. The invariable style was rooted in these strictly prescribed canons of human forms. The canon was formed with the idea of representing an object or body with maximum clarity. Therefore, the frontal views of the body is mostly applied, with the heads and legs are in profile views. The same canon to some extent bears the influence of the Paleolithic idea of representation. The canon in certain cases was also let loose, especially in the case of common folk.